Hello, can you hear me? Okay. It is with great pleasure that I will introduce Marie-Hélène Budworth, whom I've known for many years. She is the director and like very much. She is the director of the School of Human Resource Management at York University and associate professor in organizational behavior and human resource management. Her program of research is focused on individual identity and development. Much of her work explores how people learn, acquire knowledge, make choices, and negotiate with one another. She is particularly interested in how people succeed when faced with systemic barriers such as discrimination and bias. She is currently serving as associate editor at the Canadian Journal of Administrative Sciences and sits on the editorial boards of Human Resources Management Review, Organizational Dynamics, and Human Resource Developments Quarterly. And now my husband will add a few more words.
Hi. Some of you may know that for about 30 years before I retired, I ran a vocational rehabilitation business. And 1995, I hired a young McMaster undergraduate to perform a mix of part-time clerical and research duties. Almost at once, I realized that in addition to reading French and being very thorough, Marie-Hélène had a knack for intuiting exaggerations, embellishments, or slanted truths. After she had read a report or conducted an interview, she might point to a suspect statement and encourage me to investigate. Most impressively, she generally got it right. Concurrent with her studies, Marie-Hélène quickly advanced to part-time case manager and senior assessor duties. And then she continued through her undergraduate and graduate degrees, and even after she had become a tenured professor and administrator, we worked together right until I retired. I have occasionally looked at some of the things she's written, and to this day, in addition to rigor and originality, her academic work is almost invariably characterized by the questioning of conventional wisdom.
Well, that is very kind, and what a treat to be introduced by two people that I have such respect for and such love for after all of our years together. Thank you so very much. Is this okay? Because I feel like I'm blocked from you. That's okay. Great. Hello and welcome to a talk that I'm hoping will be of interest to you. It's interesting to put together a talk for a group so I'm very used to talking to scholars in management. I'm very used to talking to managers in industry, and this is somewhere in the middle, right? So this was a very interesting talk to put together. So I'm hoping I got it right is the bottom line. I wanted to set a little bit more context before I get started. And so this is just to give you a little bit more of an understanding of where this research is situated and the disciplines that underlie it. So I find myself in a school of human resource management. I was explaining this earlier, which is part of the liberal arts and professional studies faculty at York University. It is an interdisciplinary faculty. So in our faculty group, we have lawyers, sociologists, psychologists, labor studies people, management people. And the commonality is that we all study people at work. My background is that originally I was at McMaster and did biopsych, thinking that I was going to be on the science side of the world, but quickly found a deep interest in psychology and this psychology situated more clearly in the social sciences. So that is where I moved to do my graduate work. So you will see, despite the fact that my work sits within management and within HRM and organizational behavior, there are some underpinnings of psychology within it. So that's to give a little bit more context of where the work comes from. To give you a sense of the path we'll take today, I want to go through a few definitions. I've chosen to focus today on diversity. I could have focused structured this conversation in a different way. I would say that I'm largely known as a learning researcher, learning within organizations. So how people develop either through formal structures like performance management or through relationships with others, such as mentoring relationships. However, I've always had a clear interest in diversity research and research that looks at individuals who face barriers along their career path. So I wanted to this is how I've chosen the structure. The talk today is to talk largely about that body of work. And to set us off, I'm going to start with some definitions around diversity and inclusion and some of the terms that we use within the literature at the moment. Then I want to go through three themes. The themes are, the first one is around discrimination. So how do we understand and what do we know about who gets access to opportunities within the workplace and who's held back? I want to move on to talk about inclusive workplaces. And then I want to talk a little bit about identity. And I'm ending with identity because it really sets the tone for future directions of the work that I'm hoping to do. Before I get started formally, I do want to introduce Cheryl Kumar, who's in the room. Cheryl is a doctoral candidate in our department who is working with me on a few projects and whose work you will see in some of the work that I'll review today. So Cheryl can correct me when I get things wrong. Okay. So let's move on to some definitions. First, I'll define the term diversity as we use it within the organizational behavior literature. It is the differences among group members with respect to some attributes. So diversity, I like to point out, is really a count, right? Like it's really kind of a representation of me versus others versus you. So it's a count of the features that distinguish us. In the diversity research within the management literature, the most studied areas are gender and race. So there are fairly robust bodies of literature that look at gender as it pertains to progress through career, leadership, hiring, all kinds of different pieces within the management literature. There's less about other diversity characteristics. So we're starting to see a little bit more about ability. We're starting to see a little bit more about age, and we're starting to see a little bit more about sexuality. So these are emerging areas, and I will speak to a couple more emerging areas at the end of the talk. A lot of the time when management scholars, so there's always this tension with management scholarship because it's an applied area. There's often this requirement to justify what is the outcome? How is this work important, right? So often it's a performance outcome. But when it comes to diversity, there's been this movement towards developing the business case, right? Like why, can you demonstrate to us that having diversity within my organization, that having diversity on my board really leads to better outcomes for the organization, be it performance-wise, financially, however you want to talk about it. So there has been some work that has found things like that, when you have boards with more representation of women on them, you actually see more return on investment. So you see some financial outcomes that are favorable. This work is largely correlational, as you can imagine. So it's heavily criticized work, but it is work that exists. There's also another business case argument is that diversity, it gives us this potential for having a range of insights and a range of ideas that we can bring to the table, right? So there's this other set of arguments around innovation and benefiting from difference, and the idea that if we increase the diversity that we have within our organization, then we will perform better by virtue of just having deeper intellect, deeper diversity within the skills that we have available to us. The issue with this particular argument is that Diversity on its own. So remember, we're defining diversity by just having the numbers. Diversity on its own doesn't lead to the type of innovation that you hope for. Diversity on its own just gets people into the organization. But there's something that happens when you just get a diverse group of people together. You know, Steiner in 1972 in social psych would have called it process loss. It has been demonstrated quite clearly in groups research that when you have a group of people together with high levels of diversity, you actually don't see the type of synergies that you hope to see because of the complicated ways in which people have to coordinate their efforts, right? So be it conflict, be it communication, be it simply just focusing on what we have in common as a way of getting along, there are things that get in the way of benefiting from the diverse ideas. So this potential for greatness argument also seems to fall short. So there are a number of colleagues within the management area who make arguments against the business case for diversity, saying this is an insufficient rationale. It has not worked. It does not work in terms of helping us to benefit from diversity within organizations. And there's a real need to think beyond the business case. And if we're not increasing diversity within our organizations for reasons that have to do with it's a good human thing to do, ethics, the moving away from the assumption that the dominant paradigm is the right paradigm, right? All of these reasons, then we will fall short in our diversity efforts. Diversity efforts to date also exist at the space of entry to organizations. So we have done a lot of work, and I'll speak to this in a minute, in diversifying people coming into the organization, but then we do nothing to support people moving through the organization. So we have high levels of diversity at the bottom, but that diversity doesn't actually translate into leadership or more significant places of input within organizations. So while diversity is important, this idea of diversifying our workforce, it is not enough. It has some real flaws. So the literature has started to move towards this idea of really focusing on inclusion and belonging. So let me define these terms. Inclusion is equal opportunity for members of socially marginalized groups to participate and contribute. So this is full engagement with the organization at all levels and a space where people can show up and be authentically themselves, right? So there's some elements here. So there's opportunity elements, there's participation elements, and the last one is this authenticity piece, right? So which I find to be particularly interesting, because often we talk about everybody is welcome here, but when you get here, you might have to tailor your behavior, or you might have to behave in ways that are not consistent with all aspects of your identity. Right? You have to align your behavior with how you are expected to be in this organization. So inclusion asks us to create spaces where people can get in, they can be full participants, and they can be themselves. Right? That's inclusion. And belonging is the flip side to inclusion, and this is an area where Cheryl is particularly interested. Belonging is when I come to this place, to this organization, to this workplace, I feel accepted, I feel included, and I feel respected. So in an inclusive workplace, I feel I belong. Right? It's the feeling that I have when I'm in a space that is inclusive. Right? And these are, I know I'm spending a lot of time on definitions, but these are important definitions because I think they really direct where we put our efforts in terms of, if we're thinking about managers themselves, it directs where we put our efforts in terms of the types of programs we put in place and where we put our money in terms of how we support people. But in terms of research, it directs the question that we ask. Right? So for a very long time, the literature was really focused on access and discrimination, and it should be, and there's still a lot of that, and but there's a broadening of the literature. So I will start by talking a little bit about the literature that speaks to discrimination and speaks to who gets access, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusion and belonging. Right, and I'll use some of my own work to describe this. So the first theme that I want to address here is who gets access. So let's talk a little bit about research on discrimination within the management literature, the org psych OB management literature. The research in this area has looked at prescriptive and descriptive stereotypes. So prescriptive stereotypes, descriptive stereotypes, who we ought to be, who we are based on our identities, and who we ought to be based on our identities, right? And looked at how those stereotypes impact decision-making around recruitment and selection, salary decisions, promotion, and selection for training opportunities. So understanding how stereotypes guide and shift the types of decisions that we make about other people in organizational settings. I'll give you a clear example of this in some studies that I'll review. But I also want to mention, so this is an area that I won't give you an example, so I'll spend a little bit more time just describing this concept. The more recently, the literature has been quite concerned with the idea of unconscious bias. This is a term that we're probably all familiar with. I've sat on a hiring committee pretty much every year in my department for the last 10 years, and every single year I have to take unconscious bias training, right? It is part of the fabric of organizations that are aiming to be inclusive. They try and target this idea of unconscious bias. So just to unpack this a little bit, I know some of you will know this quite well, but to give you a little bit of a sense of it, unconscious bias is really this notion that we have our thinking mind, we have our mind that makes deliberate decisions, that is we want to be good people, and it is the part of our brain that guides us through the world, and that we can consciously say, in this place, this is how I want to behave. But underneath that unconscious mind, we have functions, we have ways of taking shortcuts in our experience with the world, right? We have to. The world is very busy. There's lots of information to take in, and so our brain is incredibly smart at helping us to navigate this stimuli-rich world, and it helps us to look for indicators that help us to make decisions, right? So unconscious bias is really about those subconscious processes, those things that we think before we're even thinking. And what the research in this area has assumed is that when we are making decisions like selection decisions, our unconscious mind is swaying that decision before we've even brought it to conscious awareness, right? So we are looking through a stack of resumes, and we see that somebody did their degree in a part of the world that we're not familiar with, and we dismiss that, not because, not consciously, not because I'm not aiming to be inclusive, but unconsciously, because this does not, I don't have awareness of this experience. I cannot judge this, therefore I judge it as inadequate, right? Very quickly, we make these types of decisions. So as a result of this movement, or our understanding of unconscious bias, there are any organization that is hoping to be an inclusive and productive organization, an inclusive organization, I should say, has implemented unconscious bias training, either as part of their hiring processes, the promotion processes, or for leadership generally. This is such a pervasive piece of work, piece of practical effort that it exists just everywhere. Now, there's a couple limitations to this idea. There are some folks who actually would argue, some psychologists who would argue that unconscious bias actually doesn't translate to behavior as directly as we think it does. So there is some pushback against how the concept itself operates. But then there's the training piece, and the evaluation of the training indicates the training actually doesn't work. Right? So, awareness of our faults does not improve our faults, right? And a lot of the unconscious bias training is around awareness. Know that you are a flawed thinker, and now go off and make better decisions, right? So the training itself has been found not to be robust enough to actually tap into what it is trying to tap into. this is a problematic space and a place that we are that there's still a great deal of research being done. But I do think it's funny because we often talk about this tension between being in an applied research area. We often have this tension between the scholarship and the management, and this is a place where the managers have gone, to the wall with unconscious bias training, and the research just doesn't hold it out, which is an interesting tension. All right, so we can, if that's something you want to talk about at some point in question and answer, we can certainly come back to this. But I want to go back to this this first idea around discrimination, and I'm going to look at recruitment and selection specifically because this is such a robust literature. There's so much in this space. A lot of the work originates from, or some of our knowledge, and a lot of what we rely on comes from a series of resume studies. I've listed the authors at the bottom there. You'll see actually the first author on the second piece, the Administrative Sciences Quarterly piece, Sonia Kang, is actually a colleague here at University of Toronto. So some of this work is right here. So the basic premise or the finding from these series of resume studies is that resumes with white names receive 50% more callbacks for interviews when compared to African American sounding names. So that's a representation of the resume studies that were done in the States. Now, so this is a finding it over and over again, whether it be more of experimental laboratory based or whether it be out in the world, we find this over and over again that and the same exact resume, just change the name, right? Change David to Jamal and everything changes. The interesting thing here, and this is Sonia's work that is a little bit more recent. So the resume work originates in the 90s and has a long history. But the question that Sonia asked was, now, if we look at organizations that value diversity enough to put it on the job ad, right? Because we see that now. We have these recruitment pieces where they say, here's what we're looking for. We are an equal opportunity place of employment, and we are looking for people who can diversify our workforce. And please, if that's you, apply today, right? If we see that, if that's what's on the job ad, it does not change the fact that people with racialized names are called back less often, right? So even organizations that advertise themselves to be inclusive workplaces aren't doing this right. So this is a problem because it sends a signal to candidates. Because candidates often alter their resumes based on who they're applying to, and Jamal might, sometimes choose to put James down. But if I say I'm an inclusive workplace, I'm going to put Jamal, and I'm going to let you know that I volunteer for, this particular organization that clearly identifies me, and then I'm disadvantaged myself through this process, right? So there's a real problem that persists despite organizations' intentions and stated intent to do a better job of this. Okay. A colleague, well, actually, at the time, Jennifer Harrison was a grad student. She is now on a faculty in Normandy. She's made better choices than me. She did this work as a grad student, after some coffee shop conversations about, we hear these days that hiring managers are often looking at, once you get the resume, you're Googling. You're Googling the person to find out who they are, where they've worked, what they've done. And it's just to get a little bit more insight into the person. Well, what happens when hiring managers see your online profile? So Jen had this great idea to put together packages of what she called an online presence of job seekers and then asking hiring managers to make decisions about them, right? So she actually used real live job seekers. She went online and used Twitter and a few other social media spaces to identify people who were actively looking for jobs. So they would be indicating this in some of the tweets or the information they were sharing through social media. Then she would Google them and find everything she could about them and put it together in a package that she would share with hiring managers. So this is when it becomes hypothetical. She would give a job description and a hiring recommendation sheet to hiring managers and ask them to make a recommendation, both in terms of hiring and salary for this individual based on this online. And we fabricated a resume and some other things, right? The resume stayed static across all people. So interestingly, it turns out that for the online profiles, impression management strategies were more helpful for women than men. So women who were making efforts to make statements about their accomplishments, who were indicating what their skills were and what they were capable of through their online platforms, benefited from those types of statements more than men did, which is actually the converse in real life. So we actually, years earlier, a colleague of mine, Sarah Mann, who's at Guelph, did a series of studies looking at self-promotion, men versus women in self-promotion for people who were actually, they were employed. So it's not job seeking, but it was salary negotiations. And we found that men who self-promote actually were rewarded with higher salaries than women who self-promote, because in face-to-face interactions, it seems that the gender stereotypes take effect, and there's a bit of backlash for self-promotion for women that somehow doesn't exist online. Right? So there was an interesting finding. But the other interesting finding was that women were heavily penalized for personal, non-professional images. So women who would post images of, maybe going out with friends, or look what I did this weekend, or, I spent a day at the beach, were penalized both in terms of hiring decisions and salary, where men were not. So there's some interesting findings. This was one study, as I say, that Jen did in the middle of her doctoral work. So there's definitely more to unpack here, but it is an interesting idea of how stereotypes play out in the recruitment process, particularly when we're looking at online versus, or these online profiles that we create, these online identities, right? How does the bulk of who I am based in this online world impact me? Another study that I did with colleagues that sits in this space of understanding how discrimination and stereotyping affects us in terms of our movement through career was some work on career aspirations. Now, this work was with early career women. It was a qualitative study where we did a series of focus groups, women who were just about to graduate from management programs. And it was interesting. This was an interesting piece of work as well, because the things that we learned was, some of it was unexpected, that women acknowledged a desire to balance career and family, right? And acknowledged how difficult it is to balance career and family. They also acknowledged a deep awareness of the challenges, which I found interesting just upon personal reflection. So this is me and the research now. I did not have an awareness of the challenge. And I think it's a generational thing, right? So I think that these young women have watched their mothers in particular struggle and have challenge and figure out the balance and fail and succeed and all of that tension. And they've adopted it to some extent and said, this is a really hard thing to do, really, really hard thing to do. I, on the other hand, thought I could do it all at my moment. It's like, oh no, it's all possible. I'm just going to get out there and I'm going to do the whole thing. So there was this tentativeness that existed for these individuals. They were absorbing the messages the world was telling them about the possibility. They also identified solutions for the perceived conflict, and the solutions were largely around support, the type of support they would require from a partner, the type of support they would require from employers, the type of careers that would be most, that they could navigate most easily. So again, this space of career, of the expectations of us in the world really shaping how we view our career and what we have access to. All right, so let's talk about the challenges with a diversity approach. Now, I've hinted at a lot of this already, but just to close off this before we move into inclusion, if we think about diversity as our main area of focus, there continue to be some challenges, and here's what some of the scholars have really written about a great deal. The first one is this. So McGee is an economist. You might know. She had a very popular book recently called "The Sum of Us." McGee has written that one of the main issues with the diversity approach. So this real focus on numbers, right? Like we need to hire more. We need to make sure that we have more representation. Which is I'm not undermining it. I'm saying I'm not undermining that approach. Or that viewpoint. But here's a challenge with it. A challenge is that when we talk about diversity in that way, there are people with power who view that as an attack, right? View it as it's a zero-sum game, and for others to have power, I have to give up some of my power. So there's some resistance to movement with this argument sometimes. Another challenge is that some folks think that diversity is equal to inclusivity. So if I do the work of bringing people in, if I do the work of making my space accessible rather, then I've done the work. And now it's up to them, right? And that doesn't work. What you end up with is people leaving your organization because it is not a space that actually allows them to flourish, to do well, and to build a career. There is also a challenge with express versus demonstrated commitment. So writing on your job ad, we are an inclusive hiring space, and then setting aside resumes that you don't understand or that have indicators of difference, right? So this person won't, there used to be this obsession in our literature around organizational fit. We need to hire people that fit, until we all came to understand that hiring for fit is just code for discrimination, right? It's just hiring for fit means we want to hire more people like us. So there's this express versus demonstrated commitment that is really problematic. So here are some real challenges to the diversity approach. So diversity continues to be important because people still do not have equal access to spaces. People are still not being promoted at the same rates. There's still discrepancies in salary. There's disparity at all levels, and that disparity has to be addressed through concerted effort around increasing diversity. At the same time, diversity without inclusivity is a failed prospect. Okay? I like to say, if you build inclusion, diversity will follow, right? If you build it, they will come, right? So the focus first and foremost, in my view, should be on building inclusive spaces. And if you're able to do that, then the diversity that you're seeking will follow from that. The reverse sets you up for failure. So let's talk a little bit about this second theme on inclusion. So there are some streams in the inclusion research that are robust and worth exploring. We won't go into all of them, but to give you a sense of what exists within this space, there's work group inclusion. So this is largely research that exists at the teams level, the level of the group or the team, understanding how we can put teams together that are effective, how when we put teams together, we put them together because of their diversity, and we put them together in a way where we can benefit from the diversity. Right? There are these social processes that exist that stand in the way of our ability to do so. One of my favorite is, so my favorite example to give within this is the notion that when we come together, we are more likely to discuss the things we have in common than the things that we have that are different, right? We spent 20 minutes talking about McMaster. I'm sure there are other things that are so much more interesting, but I know none of it. Because I know that you worked at McMaster, I went to McMaster. You're so smart for having worked at McMaster. You're so smart for having taken that degree at McMaster, and now we like each other, right? So there are so many social processes that operate that way, that really build on similarity and familiarity, that undermine our ability to take advantage of difference. So work group inclusion is around, that work is around understanding what those issues are and finding ways to lead groups, manage groups, help groups to benefit from the difference they bring to the table. There's also leader inclusion. So this literature looks at how do we get more representation at the top of our spaces, right? At the top of our organizations. You know, the old adage of if you can see it, you can be it, right? So there need to be more examples, more shared experiences of people who aren't traditional leadership roles, achieving leadership roles for others to follow in that path. So there's a robust literature looking at how do we try, and now we've hired people, how do we move them through the organization in order to get them into more senior roles? There's perceived organizational inclusion. So there's a robust literature looking at, I as an employee, what are the features of this organization that make me feel that it is a place where I belong, or I would perceive this place to be an inclusive space. Then there's this organizational practices inclusion. This one is very practical and interesting. This is looking at what are the types of efforts that we can put forward to build inclusive spaces, right? So there's a robust literature looking at things like sponsorship programs and mentoring programs and training programs, and all of these really like practice-oriented initiatives that can support and drive inclusion. So there's a robust literature, a group of people who are examining what are the most effective ways that we can structure policies and practices that support inclusive work environments. And finally, there's inclusive climate. So in organizational research, we talk about a difference between culture and climate, right? Culture is the institution, climate is the local environment. So, culture is York University for me, climate is my department. Right? So how do we build workspaces, where people spend their every day? How do we build spaces? So it's we might have inclusive policies, an inclusive leader, we might have inclusive practices and programs, but then we have these places where people work, where things aren't consistent. So there's a need to look at all levels of inclusivity. So this is the research that exists out there, but I want to give you some examples of inclusion and belonging from some of the work that's being done within my group. And this is where I get a chance to talk about Cheryl's work. And Cheryl, I've stolen one of your charts, but you were here, so I thought it would be fine. And I've given you full. It's not stealing if you cite it. So this work actually represents Cheryl's dissertation. It's super interesting because there's very little that looks at belonging as it relates to inclusion, right? So there's a fairly robust discussion about inclusion and how to build inclusive workplaces and inclusive leadership practices and so on and so on. But this idea of looking at belonging is novel, is interesting. So what Cheryl wants to look at is how does somebody experience belonging based on the cues that they receive from the organization? So I live within this organization. the organization is telling me something about who it is, who it values, and how do I read those cues? Right. So she's chosen two cues. One is racial or ethnic representation. That speaks to what we talked about earlier when we were thinking of, I have to, you can, if I see it, I can be it, right? Like if I see people who are like me at higher spaces within the organization, then I believe it's possible for me to also get there. And then there's this other measure of just workplace racial discrimination. So what is my perception of how the attitudes and practices within this organization? I think Cheryl has chosen a fantastic sample in that she's looking at lawyers, right? It is like a space that has a very long history. It's a very structured space, and it has real clarity about who is at the top and who is who's the levels are clear. So Cheryl's looking at racialized individuals at the beginning of their career, or who are at different points in the beginning of their career, and looking at the signals that they're receiving about whether or not it's possible to become partner, whether or not it's possible to do well in this career or in this place. She has two studies, one that looks at law students and is a bit more experimental in that she's manipulated some, what are they called? Press releases. She's manipulated press releases about who's just received partnership within an organization as an indicator of representation, and have some measures that follow. And then the other is within organizations, people early career, looking at their own perceptions of their experiences within their career. So you can see that it's a more complex model. There's some other elements in here, but essentially she's looking at intentions and career aspirations. Right? So how does my sense of belonging in this career, in this vocation, how does it impact the decisions I make about the next steps in my career? Right? An interesting question. The data is in the database and being analyzed as we speak. So hopefully we'll have more to tell you about this very soon. Here's another example of work that I'm doing that is in this inclusion space. And this is with a colleague of mine who's now in Texas, much to her chagrin. She is now in Texas. There's nothing wrong with Texas, but she happens to be at one of the universities that is actually where she's having trouble doing this research. Right? So we are looking at well-being, the idea of well-being, which is it's a very popular idea in organizational psychology or HRM. This idea of, how do we build spaces where people can flourish and where there's work-life balance, and we want to engage our employees by encouraging them to live whole lives, right? But Huda and I, and actually Jamie Grumman, who's at the University of Guelph, are asking, yeah, but for who? Well, who gets the well-being? Right. So this is very early work. So because of that, it's exploratory. Right. So we're using the framework of privilege, this idea of privilege, to explore the idea of well-being. We've conducted a series of qualitative studies of working professionals from a range of demographic groups, and in this early work, we're being less controlled. We are looking for everybody and anybody, and asking them to identify their own difference or their own ways in which they feel they have been excluded or disadvantaged. But we've asked them about their experiences of well-being as well within their careers, within the organizations they work for. So these initial findings, and these are really, really initial in that the interviews are still going. Well-being is understood for them, this is for the respondents or for the interviewees, in terms of psychological safety and job security. So when they're talking about well-being, what they're talking about, psychological safety means this is a place where I feel I can take a risk, I can fail, I feel that I'm trusted, right? So they're talking about well-being in these terms of their relationship with the organization. and in terms of their connection to whether or not they feel that they're secure in the work in the job that they have. And we're finding that this experience of disadvantage, so when they reflect on when they reflect on their own identities, it sometimes undermines their feelings of well-being, either temporarily or permanently, right? So we're seeing that well-being is not experienced the same for depending on the individual, their experience with the organization, whether they are made to feel other, right? There's less stability in the feeling of well-being if people are made to feel other in the spaces that they're existing. Yeah. So again, hopefully more to tell you about this in future, but I think it's a really promising and interesting area. We're hoping to expand this idea of looking at privileged type of work arrangements into the work-life balance literature. That will come after this. So thirdly, this is identity. This is the third space in which we've done some work, Cheryl and I in particular have done some work that really takes stock of the existing literature as a way of getting started. And I want to share some of that with you. But I again, a couple definitions. I want to define first a term that you might know already. This is Kim Crenshaw's work on intersectionality. So you will notice a lot of the work that I've reviewed so far really it looks at one identity at a time, right? Gender, race. It does not look at when identities overlap. So what happens if you're a Black woman, right? You have a different experience than you would if you were a white woman, right? Those are different experiences because of the intersection of gender with race. So while we study these categories as categorical, they are far more complex. This is Kim Crenshaw. So I say this out loud only to acknowledge that I know about the limitation. And yes, it is a limitation, and it absolutely needs to be addressed. And we do see some early work that is doing this, and they're really like it's really creative. There's moments I think when your field kind of makes some movements, and you're like, that is a very creative way to study something. And so it's really interesting and creative work, and I look forward to seeing more here. But I don't think we'll know everything we need to know about this area until we start to adopt more complicated frameworks, right? So here's another way in which we are complicating identity. And this is the work that Cheryl and I are doing. And this has to do with multiracial identity. So this is our emerging research, something that we hope to develop a program of research around. And so multiracial identity is this case where an individual, so within a particular domain, race, might hold multiple identities, right? So intersectionality is when you hold multiple identities across domains, but there's also the case where you can hold multiple identities within a domain. And the case of this that we will look at is multiracial identity. I'm about to put up a chart. There's a lot on it. Don't be overwhelmed, because I'm overwhelmed. This is the initial. This is the output of our initial work on the subject, which really looks at the literature and helps us to make sense of the existing literature. So here's the thing about management scholarship. Often we just take things from other fields. And this is an example of that. So this is, there is a great deal of work on multiracial identity in social psychology or in other parts of psychology. And we have taken or tried to understand what we know already based on this work that's been done kind of more broadly. And we want to take it into our space, looking at management and achievement within organizations and how people navigate their work lives with this multiracial identity framework in mind. So Cheryl has done this lovely work of identifying three major themes within the existing literature in social psychology. The first is multiracial identity fluidity. So this is the notion that people who hold multiple identities might choose to lean into one identity over another, depending on the social context. Right? So when you are in an organizational setting, it might benefit you to highlight a particular one of your identities in particular, and to mute the other possibly. And then when you're in a social setting, it might benefit you in other ways, right? So you can, there's having different identities within the same domain gives you this fluidity. And we want to explore, what does this mean in terms of some of the ideas that are more relevant to the management literature? Those that we've identified are impression management, authenticity, leadership, emotional labor, and disclosure. So we actually, this is some work that we're starting already. I see it too, leadership's twice, yeah. We've just noticed a typo on our slide. The disclosure of stigmatized identities is something that we are starting to work on right away because of an opportunity that exists for an upcoming conference on disclosure, to look at disclosure and when the ways in which we might choose to tell people about identities that might not be entirely visible. The second theme here is perceiving multiracial identity. So this has to do with how the other sees the person who holds multiracial identity. So again, some themes from our literature are stereotypes, threats to identity, discrimination, microaggressions, all of these familiar topics from the early part of our talk. How does somebody with multiracial identity experience this? There is evidence from social psychology to say that it's different. It's a different experience. And then finally, the individual who holds two identities, what is their experience of holding these two identities in terms of how they navigate the workplace? How do they understand diversity and inclusion policies? You know, to share a personal example, there is to disclose, I am of multiracial identity. This is why I'm interested in this topic area. There comes a point in your study, in your research, where you just end up researching yourself, right? So here I am. And there is a grant that's available at York to Black scholars. The Black Scholars Fund is what it's called. York has taken some initiatives for Black and Indigenous scholars to support their work. And I often think, can I apply to that? Is that for me? Right? So that's the experiencing multiracial identity piece, right? All of these programs, these ideas, these initiatives that we put forward in organizations to support people. For who, for when, who's excluded, you know, those are some of the questions that we want to look at. All right, so this is the two clear projects that we have. In addition to this literature review, which is largely complete, which is in great shape, we want to start to do some qualitative exploration now, just talking to people who hold multiracial identities and understanding their experiences, getting some broader input so that we can help to frame out a program of research. But again, we do have this disclosure idea that we'll study immediately based on some motivation or some pushing to do this as an early project. Disclosure as a strategy, right? As an impression management strategy. All right. So with that, I will close off the formal part of the talk and